Good evening. Good evening. Can everybody hear me in the back? All good? Thank you. My name is Kate Summers, and I'm the current president of the Friends of the Arlington Public Library. And on behalf of the library board, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. As many of you know, the Friends of the Arlington Public Library provides all the programming support for our library system. We fund events like the one we're at tonight, author events. We do our fantastic summer reading, a lot of our maker events. All of that comes from fundraising, largely supported by you. So I am here tonight just to say thank you. Thanks to all of you who are dues-paying members of the Friends of the Arlington Public Library. And if you're not yet a member, you can see me after the event. I'm happy to sign you up. Memberships start at just $5 a year. Thanks to all of you who showed up at the April 2nd County Budget Board meeting. Special thanks to you. Thanks for telling our elected officials just how important the library system is to you and to our community. Thanks to all of you who donated your books, your magazines, your maps and movies and music. Thanks to Marie Kondo for suggesting all of that. We're selling all of it at our book sales, at our bookstores, at area branches. And lastly, I want to say thanks to all of you who came out for our spring full book sale. The numbers are in. We actually did our calculation of revenue during that sale. I am pleased to report that we made, in 4 days, selling used books, many of them for like a quarter, $101,000. Yes.
Amazing.
Yes. And all of that money is coming back to the library to fund important events like the one we're having tonight. So thank you. Thanks to all of you for your support. And if you're interested in getting involved with the Friends of the Arlington Library, please see me after the event. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Diane Kresh, the director of the Arlington Library System, and a woman whose vision of inclusivity, of importance of library programming, makes our mission and our support a true joy. So, Diane Kresh.
Hi, good evening, and happy Earth Day. And thank you, Kate and the Friends of the Library, for your ongoing support. And thank you to all of you. How many of you have been to an Arlington Reads event before? It's awesome. I mean, we do this really for all of you. This is a great community. It's a reading community. It's a curious community. We like to have interesting conversations, and Arlington Reads has been a wonderful part of that now since 2006. So our success is our shared success, and I really want to give all of you a hand for supporting us in this way. Our 2019 series, Our Stories, Ourselves, features 4 women writers, each gifted in the arts of memoir, poetry, and prose. Some of you were here on March 14 for a delightful evening with Jacqueline Woodson, young adult author and poet. How many of you were here for that? It was a great evening. Last week we hosted a lively evening with poet and memoirist Mary Carr. Anybody here for that? Okay. And on May 16, we will host Tracy K. Smith, who's the Pulitzer Prize-winning Poet Laureate of the United States, and she's the author of Ordinary Light, her memoir of race, faith, and a mother's love. We'll close this season on June 3rd with Marion Winnick, who's a longtime All Things Considered commentator and whose latest book is The Baltimore Book of the Dead. And if you haven't read it, put it on your list. It's a treasure. Next year's Arlington Reads theme is We the People, and we will examine issues central to our practice of democracy, which means we'll be talking about the press, the role of the press, social movements, etc. So we're just now finalizing the authors. Please watch our website for details. Tonight, however, belongs to Susan Orlean, author and journalist who's been called a national treasure by the Washington Post. A staff writer for The New Yorker since 1992 and a former contributing editor at Rolling Stone and Vogue, Orlean has been praised as an exceptional essayist, a writer who approaches her subjects with intense curiosity and fairness. And books like Rin Tin Tin, The Life and the Legend, and The Orchid Thief, a true story of beauty and obsession, have earned her a reputation as one of America's most distinctive journalistic voices. Orlean is currently Rogers Communications Chair in Literary Journalism at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity in Alberta, Canada, and she's also the host with actress Sarah Tyre of the podcast Crybabies, a series of candid conversations with creative guests about the books, music, TV, and movies that make us cry. Tonight we're discussing her latest work, the instant New York Times bestseller, The Library Book. Everybody's read it, right? An engrossing story of the history, allure, and future of public libraries told against the backdrop of a devastating fire at the Los Angeles Central Library in 1986. We hope you will take a few minutes to enjoy our lobby exhibit celebrating the unique contributions libraries and librarians have made to our communities. Whether the library we visited as children, Richard Brautigan's Library of Unpublished Books, the Carnegie Library in Columbus, Ohio, even the little free libraries that adorn our front yards, libraries exist to gather and protect our stories, to keep us curious and informed, to comfort those who are troubled and connect those who are newly arrived. They say to each one of us, you belong here. The library book was included on the New York Times list of 100 notable books of 2018 and the Washington Post Best Books of 2018. Author Dave Eggers wrote, "This is a book only Susan Orlean could have written. Somehow she manages to transform the story of a library fire into the story of literacy, civil service, municipal infighting and vision, public spaces in an era of increasing privatization and social isolation, the transformation of Los Angeles from small provincial hamlet to innovative colossus and model of civic engagement, and the central role libraries have always and will always play in the life and health of a bustling democracy. Beyond all that, like any good library, it's bursting with incredible tales and characters. There could be no better book for the bookish, and we agree. Please welcome Susan Orlean.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane. And thank you all for being here. I have to say, the weather is so much better than when I was supposed to be here originally. So I feel very, very lucky. This was an auspicious act of God, which is what it says in on your airline tickets, that they're not responsible for acts of God. But I'm incredibly happy to be here now, and I appreciate your all being here so much.
Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit, and then we will open it up for questions, and someone later on will tell us how we're going to do that. But for right now, I want to start at the very beginning and how you came to write the book.
Well, this book evolved, which was not the way many of my books have been sort of a lightning strike, where one day I just hear something and decide I'm doing that book. This was a little bit different. It emerged in 3 different distinct parts, one of which was simply being in the library one day and looking around and having that, what I think of as this sort of journalist itch of thinking, how do libraries work? I mean, I've been in libraries thousands of times in my life, and I actually have no idea how they work. Someone should write a book about that. Not me, but somebody should write a book about that. And the reason I say not me is that I was not looking to write another book. I had decided that I was done writing books. I didn't want to make that kind of commitment. It's just too much work. The next thing that occurred, I filed this in the back of my mind and thought, I think it's an interesting idea, but that's, friends don't let friends write books. The next thing that happened was my husband and I had moved to Los Angeles. My son was in first grade, and very early on in the school year, he got an assignment to write about someone, to interview someone who worked for the city. So he's first grade, 5 years old, little wild boy, and I kind of thought about it, and I said, why don't you interview a garbage man? And he sized me up and thought, she's a writer, how about if I interview a librarian? And I thought, I am such a good mother. So we headed to the library, and this was the first time we'd gone to our branch library in LA. And when I walked in, even though it doesn't bear any resemblance to the library I went to growing up, I was overwhelmed with memories of going to the library with my mother, which we did every week, several times a week throughout my growing up. I was almost speechless. The memory was so potent, and it was something I hadn't thought about in a long time. And I thought, what is it about a library that is so emotional? I mean, if you look at it on a very clinical level, it's just a building with books in it. And yet, that's not how we feel at all. It's such an emotional connection. It's something so profound and so affecting. And these memories of going to the library with my mother were so vivid. It was overwhelming. And I thought, someone should write a book about this. Not me, but somebody. So fast forward a couple of weeks, I was asked by the Friends of the LA Library to give a talk, and as a fundraiser, and I went. They were holding it in a country club somewhere in LA. After I gave my talk, the head of the Friends group came up to me and he said, I really want to thank you. I'd like to offer you a tour of the downtown library. And I was very excited because I didn't know LA had a downtown. So I said, I would love to go. I mean, this is going to be, what an adventure. When I went to meet him, I immediately fell in love with the building. I'm not sure if any of you have been to the LA Library, but it doesn't look like a typical big city library. It doesn't look like the New York Public Library or Chicago Public Library. It's a very whimsical building, very eccentric. It looks a little bit like the architect had fallen asleep with a book about King Tut and a book about Art Deco under his pillow, and then woke up and started drawing. And I just fell in love with the building. And as we were walking through, I just got more and more excited hearing the stories of the building, of the patrons, of the history of the place. We wandered over to the fiction section, and the gentleman giving me the tour stopped in front of one of the bookshelves and pulled a book off the shelf and held it up and took a deep whiff of the book. And I thought, I'm new to LA. Maybe it's a thing here. Do I take another book off the shelf and smell it? Do I smell the book he's smelling? What do I do? So I just stood there kind of smiling and nodding my head, and he said, you can still smell the smoke in some of them. And I didn't know what he meant, and I said, did you used to let people smoke in the library? And he said, no, from the fire. And I said, from what fire? And he said, the big fire in 1986. It closed the library for 7 years. And my jaw dropped. And I said, what are you talking about? And at that moment, I knew that someone should write a book about it. And I literally went home that day, and I knew that I was going to write this book. And I basically called my agent and said, here we go again. And from that point forward, and it was 6.5 years that it took me to write the book.
Right. So the structure of the book was really interesting to me because it's sort of like a series of concentric circles, and you pull it all together. I mean, you start with describing the color of the arson, the alleged arsonist's hair. That's the page 1, and it was yellow for those of you who haven't read it yet. And then you go from there, and you're talking about history of libraries, and you do talk about the fire, but then you talk about your own relationship with books and reading and the book burning incident, which I'll let you describe a little bit later. But so the structure itself was interesting. So how did that reveal itself? Like when you started out, was it, I'm going to find out how this fire started, or was it something else?
Well, when I heard that the fire was arson, and it was essentially a cold case. My first thought was, well, I'm going to solve this, which is an incredible amount of vanity. Just FYI, arson is probably the single most difficult crime to investigate, and it's the least successfully prosecuted of all felonies. And yet here I was planning to crack this case. And over time, I began to realize that wasn't what the book was going to be about. But I began by reporting every element. It felt to me like a starburst, that you have this building, this institution that evokes tremendous emotion. It has an incredibly rich history that I wanted to learn. Its history is inextricably connected to the history of LA, which I was new to LA. I didn't know anything about LA history. I needed to know everything I could know about the young man accused of the arson. I needed to understand arson. I needed to learn about the history of burning of libraries, which sadly is as old as the history of libraries. So I reported the story in every different direction, not really having any idea of how I would structure it. When I finally sat down to write, I began seeing, as you say, this concentricity of stories, that each one was nestled inside the other one and the next one and the next one. I finally surrendered to what felt like the organic inevitability of the book, which was that it is many different volumes, all in one book, that you browse from story to story, much the way you would browse through a library, that you read a little about Harry Peake, and then you read a little about the history of burned libraries in World War II, and then you come to the present day of the library, and then you go back to Harry Peake. That it was, in a sense, you were browsing the library of stories about the library, and that there was no single story that became the dominant story, that these were all interwoven in a way that you couldn't just tell one. They all seemed so dependent on each other to be meaningful.
And then to your point about the history of Los Angeles, you wrote a lot about the different folks who had been director, Charles Loomis, Althea Warren, Wyman
Jones, yeah.
And that took on a whole other part to the book.
And this was, I didn't expect to go down this particular rabbit hole. I thought, well, I'll just have a list of the people who've run the library. I thought I would just dispense with it very quickly. And even though I learned shortly after I began reporting the book, I came upon two important salient facts. One is that the people who run libraries have a higher than likely percentage of being unusual.
That's true. I will own that.
And on the other hand, the people who are attracted to living in LA seem to have a slightly higher likelihood of being unusual. So you have these two Venn diagrams with a fascinating overlap, which is people who live in LA who have run the library. A very special subset, and one that proved to me to be irresistible. Right. I literally had thought originally that I would just sort of tick off who had run the library over the years. It just didn't seem that it would be that compelling a part of the book, even though it was important, of course. But then I started learning a little bit about Charles Lummis, and let me just tell you a little bit about him, and you can see how I got kind of sucked in. Charles Lummis was a Harvard dropout who had been living in Cincinnati, working as a journalist, and was hired around the turn of the century by the LA Times, which was a brand new newspaper at the time. So Charles Lummis packed up his belongings and walked from Cincinnati to LA, as one does, and began his career as a journalist in LA. I will say that along the way, he was writing a journal of his walk across the country that drew so much attention that hundreds of people would come out and see him as he walked through their town. When he became the head of the library in its own remarkable way, which was he didn't have any training as a librarian, although he was a scholar and an author and certainly a very, very intelligent man, but he wasn't trained as a librarian. At the time, the library in LA was being run by a woman named Mary Jones, who was actually the first trained librarian to run the library. And she was doing a great job. She was well-liked and well-respected. She was called in one day to a meeting of the board, and they said, you're doing a wonderful job, but we would all agree that it would be better to have a man run the library. Wouldn't you? And she said, basically, no. And she refused to resign. They wanted her to resign. She wouldn't resign. It launched what is known, and this is a sort of hidden piece of history that I stumbled upon and that I couldn't resist writing about. It was known informally as the Great Library War, and thousands of women marched in the streets of LA protesting Mary Jones's being pushed out of her job. I won't tell you all the details so you can read about it in the book, but ultimately Charles Lummis did take over as the head of the library, and he was an extremely unusual head librarian. He wrote out menus for the staff's lunch because he was concerned that they ate too much candy. He hated when people read books that he thought were stupid. So he had a branding iron made with the skull and crossbones, and he branded the books that he thought were particularly stupid, and then put slips of paper in them saying there are far better books on this subject. And he was a remarkable man, and in many ways a really brilliant man, and certainly transitioned the library from its beginning which was very typical of libraries, which was a small institution for educated men. Mm-hmm. Women didn't really have full privileges. Children were not permitted at all. And it was really essentially run like a private club, even though it was a public institution. He, despite his Harvard background and his eccentricity, to be gentle about it, believed firmly in this democratic ideal that the library should be a place that welcomes everyone, from scholars to newspaper boys to factory workers, and that it should be used to better people, and that they could use it to raise their station in life. And it was a pretty radical idea at the time. So as much as you might look at him and think, this is the guy who deposed Mary Jones, he's also the person who brought a truly democratic mission to the library, and many of the changes that he instituted, and this is in 1905, are actually not only active in the library, but essential to the way the library is run today.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about the fire itself. In the course of writing the book, you conducted a lot of interviews, but basically, can you reconstruct a little bit of what happened on April 29th in 1986?
This was a very ordinary day, a weekday, beautiful spring day in the library. It was at 10, a little bit after 10 in the morning, and a fire alarm went off. Now, to give you a little context, the building in 1986 was 60 years old. It had been built in 1926. It was in terrible shape. It had books piled in every corner. It had 1 million fire code violations. It had no air conditioning. They would close the library down when the temperature inside got over 95 degrees. It was really an aging dowager, to be kind about it. The fire alarm went off all the time, so nobody really got excited. When the fire alarm went off, they would just sort of grudgingly leave the building, and that's exactly what happened in that day. There were about 200 staff, 200 patrons. They all left the building. The fire department showed up, and they probably felt the same way, which was, oh God, here we go again. And they checked the fire alarm, walked around, didn't see anything, went down to reset the alarm, and it wouldn't reset. So they went and did another walk around the building and suddenly noticed a little trickle of smoke in the fiction section. It trickled, and then it grew, and then it burst into flame. So the fire exploded, and you can imagine a library has so much flammable material, and this fire began roaring. It reached 2,500 degrees. It was so hot that it wasn't just burning books. The steel bookshelves melted. The fire was primarily in the stacks, which are the parts of the library where the books that are not out on the shelves are kept. And these stacks were basically cement tubes filled with books, 7 stories high. Basically reminding you of what? A chimney. Yeah, right. And they literally were built like chimneys, right, but lined with books. The fire burned for 7.5 hours. And the fire department had nearly every single piece of equipment there attacking the fire. Finally, after 7.5 hours, the flames were at last put out. And when they walked around the building and took stock of what had happened, they came to the realization that 400,000 books had been completely destroyed, and 700,000 were damaged. And the building was closed for the next 7 years. And one of the things that had to be done immediately was to get those 700,000 damaged books out of the building. And the ones that were wet had to be put into freezers, because a wet book will mold very quickly, 48 hours, and once it molds, it's lost. So somebody had to find someone who had a really big freezer. And also, thousands of people gathered to help pack these books and get them out of the building, and had to do it in 2 days, which was amazing. And the books were packed up and stored primarily in frozen food depots. So they were literally between, broccoli and shrimp. And the thing that's funny is I don't think the owners of these frozen food warehouses, I'm sure they thought it would be like for a couple days. And it was 6 years. So, and it's pretty amazing that they were willing to do it. When the money was raised and the technology was sorted out, it became the largest book restoration project ever undertaken.
Right.
And actually, I think it became, in many ways, a sort of case study of how to restore books.
Right. So we think about the books, and we think of the books that we have in our library here, but if you can give us a flavor of the kinds of books that were lost, permanently lost.
I think I'll read to you a little section of the list of books that were lost. What was lost? A volume of Don Quixote from 1860, illustrated by French printmaker Gustave Doré. All of the books about the Bible, Christianity, and church history. All biographies of subjects H through K. All American and British plays. All Shakespeare. 90,000 books about computers, astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, medicine, seismology, engineering, and metallurgy. All of the unbound manuscripts in the science department. A book by architect Andrea Palladio from the 1500s. 5.5 million American patent listings dating from 1799. All Canadian patent material from approximately the same period. 45,000 works of literature, authors A through L. A leaf from a 1635 Coverdale Bible, which was the first translation in modern English. The entire collection of the Jane's Annuals for Aircraft, dating back several decades. 9,000 business books, 6,000 magazines, 18,000 social science books, a first edition of Fannie Farmer's Boston Cooking School cookbook from 1896, 12,000 cookbooks, including 6 books of popcorn recipes. All of the art periodicals and every single art book printed on glossy paper. Every ornithology book, 3/4 of all the library's microfilm, and the information labels on 20,000 photographs, which fell off when they got wet.
Yeah. So the restoration effort, the staff was very involved in it, and the community as well. So can you just describe a little bit, after the, the shock of, oh my gosh, what do we have to deal with? How did the staff get involved? How were they organized? And then the second part is, how did the community contribute to rebuilding the collection?
Well, it's really, in many ways, a wonderful story. Obviously, it's a terrible incident, but any notion you have that LA doesn't have a civic spirit or that it's not a city of readers is simply proven to be false in what came after. First of all, the city had insurance of course, on the building, which survived the fire in remarkably good shape. It did not have insurance on the books. So all of the books that were lost, all of the books that had to be restored, all of that money had to be raised. And there was a huge effort that ended up drawing in people from every not only the city itself, but the surrounding area. And they raised $10 million, which in 1986 money was a huge amount of money. People came, packed books to get out of the building. The librarians were there from the beginning, like doing physical labor to save the books and salvage them. A temporary library was set up downtown, but the next few years were spent raising money to replace these books. And then this is funny because it had never even occurred to me when they finally reopened the building, they had to put all the books back, which meant another huge effort that thousands of people turned up to help offload these books and shelve them and get them back on the shelves in the right order and get the library working again. So it really was a communal effort. There was no way this could have been done without a huge number of bodies involved and without people really rising to the need of raising a huge amount of money to help rebuild the collection. And certainly some of the collection could not be rebuilt. I mean, you don't simply go and reorder these things. I mean, this is, I was talking to the Wyman Jones, who had been the head of the library at the time, and he said, and maybe he was exaggerating, but he said the books came from 1,000 different vendors. So you don't just go on Amazon and put 2 million books in your shopping cart and click buy. I mean, it involves sourcing these books from hundreds of different places. And it took years before the library was back to the number of books it had at the time of the fire. Some would say that we now are more, the investment now has been in a lot of digital material too that can't be destroyed in the same way, but libraries are incredibly vulnerable. And they're, up until 1986, the American Library Association recommended against sprinkler systems, which is something I'm sure you're aware of, that the fear was that something would trigger sprinklers and that would do more damage than a fire might. Now the library is sprinklered. It has halon or whatever the other gases in the rare book room. There's a lot of, the technology for preserving books has improved hugely since 1986. But at the very bottom line, it was the effort of the people, the librarians, and the public of LA to have the library literally rise out of the ashes.
Now, were you able to interview librarians who had actually been in the building at the time?
Yeah, I interviewed quite a few of them. Many of them, the majority of them are now retired. But there are still a few people working at the library who were there at the time of the fire. And, it was traumatic for them. It literally traumatic. And the city of LA hired a psychologist to work with the librarians because many of them had essentially PTSD.
Sure.
I mean, they stood there watching the work. Librarians don't just stamp a due date on your book. I mean, they actually build these collections, and they're actively involved in making decisions about what books are there.
You
and
forgot that we say shh too.
Right. Yeah. But it's interesting to realize that I now am so much more appreciative of what librarians actually do. But they were truly traumatized, and many of them, they had regular meetings with the psychologist because they were so rattled. And 7 hours to watch your professional life burn down. And I just the other day saw video footage of the fire, which I had never seen. I'd only seen still pictures.
Right.
And I mean, it was, a fire roaring at 2,500 degrees. I mean, the building was flame was just exploding out of the windows. It was horrible.
Right.
It was really horrible. And I can only imagine that their experience of it was just a gutting experience.
So I want to return a little bit to Harry Peake, because he's the other really essential story in the book. And how did he rise in suspicion for the crime, and kind of what happened to him in the end?
Well, Harry Peake was the kind of guy you see around LA a lot. He was handsome, charming, tall, swaggering, probably the best looking guy in his high school class, who then thought, well, the natural sort of transition in his life was to be a movie star, and came to LA and was parking cars and running, was a messenger and barely getting by. Mm-hmm. He had one significant personality trait that proved problematic, which was he was a pathological liar. Mm-hmm. And even his own mother said to me that he was a pathological liar, which is really bad if your mother says it. He loved being the center of attention. He loved having his life seem more dramatic than it really was. How did he become a suspect in the fire? Well, he began telling people he had started it, which is, number one, bad idea if you don't want to become a suspect. Secondly, there was someone seen in the library the morning of the fire who was kind of walking into the staff areas where the public was not permitted to go, and several different librarians had seen what appeared to be the same young man who more or less fit Harry's description. Harry, besides bragging to his friends that he had started the fire, he then told the arson investigators that he had started the fire. And they said, oh, okay, that's interesting. We'd like just to get a polygraph test, which he then failed. Then he came up with not just one, but 7 different alibis regarding where he was the day of the fire. And I have to say, I'm not looking down the long road to a life of crime, but I would say the one takeaway from this was, if you are accused of a crime, stick with one alibi. Don't go with 7. So he became, he vacillated between saying he had done it and then saying he hadn't done it, but he knew things about the day of the fire that would have been difficult to know if you hadn't been there. Mm-hmm. In particular, he mentioned bumping into an older woman and knocking her over as he was leaving the building and stopping and helping her up. Mm-hmm. And that had happened. Someone had knocked a woman over, a security guard had noticed it, this young man had helped her up, and then left the building. So he became the city's one prime suspect, and the case took many, many convoluted turns from that point. But it really began with him telling people that he had done it, and then his roommate's mother called the tip line and said, I think I know who did it. Mm-hmm.
So near the end of the book, you were talking, I think, with a forensic specialist, a fire specialist, who basically said, the arsonist, the people investigating kind of landed on it was arson, and they never really moved on from there, whereas his opinion was it probably wasn't. It was, a short in a coffee pot cord or something like that.
Right.
And I guess, most of the evidence had been destroyed, so So is this one of those then really cold cases, they're never going to really figure out what started the fire?
You know, I think that yes. I mean, first of all, it was very interesting for me to begin learning a little bit about arson investigation, because when you see the photographs of the fire, you can't imagine that there's any evidence that you could possibly salvage. It was just charred.
Right.
It was just black soot. That's what the library looked like. The idea that you could find anything in those conditions seemed remarkable to me. But arson is very, very difficult to solve. It has become one of those crimes where the re-examination of some of these very high-profile arsons where there were fatalities
Right.
there are a very high percentage of them, upon being re-examined, have been shown to not have been arson.
Right.
And that arson, the tools of arson investigation were really outdated. They didn't represent forensic science particularly. And it was almost oral tradition. One firefighter would explain to the next how you investigate arson, and that's how it was done, without it actually being held to the more typical standards of forensic science. So when I interviewed this man who runs something called the Arson Project, which is similar to the Innocence Project, where they re-examine arsons where there's some question about the validity of the investigation. And he said, knowing that he wasn't really able to examine the scene, but it stands to reason that a library with all sorts of electrical problems, which there was no question that this had electrical problems, that there was a good reason to wonder whether maybe it was not arson at all. No other suspect ever emerged in any credible way. Harry Peake might have started the fire, but his own credibility as a witness is so questionable. And there was never hard evidence. It was all circumstantial. It was based on this identification of him. It was based on his confession. And the fact that he, as I said, knew certain things that had taken place that day, but that doesn't mean he started the fire, and that's the problem. It might have proven that he was in the library, but it still didn't prove he started the fire.
Right.
Is it a cold case? I think it probably is.
So I want to go back to something you alluded to a little bit ago about the book burnings in the 30s, and just wrap that with your impressions about libraries in general and their value to the community. So you did an experiment that you describe in the book about what it was like to burn a book. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, and this was not meant to be prescriptive in any way. I decided to burn a book for two reasons. First of all, I was going to be writing about this event in which 400,000 books were burned, and I realized I had never seen a book burn, and I thought it would be useful to have the visual reference so that I could write the descriptive parts of the chapter on the fire with that knowledge. But there was a deeper reason, and it was the reason that resonated through the book for me, and that was this exploration of why it was so difficult to burn a book, why we feel such a connection to books. I mean, I could burn a book and go and buy another copy. I mean, you could say, well, that's a waste of money, but that's not what it's about. It's a deep, almost gut level taboo to burn a book. It's a taboo that has been preyed upon by repressive regimes since the beginning of time, that there is a certain horror we feel when a book is burned. It represents a human voice in a way. Now with the books being created in multiple copies, it's not that we think, oh my God, that's the only one of that book. And yet, there is still a level at which it is a repulsive act. It is never done except with the idea of terrorizing people.
Right.
It's almost as if you conjure through the history of time, this association with book burning by burning a single book. I had gotten to a point where I didn't think I could do it. I just thought, you know what, I can't explain it, but I can't do this. And not being able to do it actually supported my theories and my themes in the book, which was that we have a connection to books that is deeper than something that we can express, or it's not a material thing. I mean, we all love books, they're beautiful objects, but our connection is a spiritual one.
Right.
And to destroy a book feels like a spiritual wound. I finally, I just didn't think I could do it. I thought, well, I'll burn a book I don't like. And then I thought, well, that's awful. I'm not going to burn a book I don't like. And I thought, I'll burn a book I like. And then I thought, well, that's even more awful. I don't want to do that. I thought, well, I'll burn one of my books because I have a lot of copies of them. And then I thought, I can't burn one of my own books. I'll go into therapy for years trying to get over this. So I thought, you know what? I can't do this. I can't figure it out. And one day my husband came home and he was just grinning ear to ear, and he said, I found your book for you to burn. And he handed me a copy of Fahrenheit 451. And I knew that Ray Bradbury, of all people, Ray Bradbury, who loved the LA Public Library, who spent most of his childhood there teaching himself because he couldn't afford college, who wrote this book about the horrors of book burning, would have appreciated very much this afternoon on a very hot, sunny day in LA where I sat in my backyard and burned a copy of his book.
So you talked about the primal connection that people feel with books and libraries. We often think of libraries as being the soul of the community. And I'm just, and yet I've been in the profession for a long time, and pretty much since the advent of the internet, there's the death knell for, well, we don't need libraries, everything's online, who cares, why, and so why are they important? I mean, we talk about stories and a clean, well-lighted place where people can feel like they're part of community, but it goes deeper than that. Like,
Right.
What is so vital about libraries and access to libraries and freedom of information that makes them so important, maybe even now more than ever?
Well, I absolutely think we need libraries, and they resonate as much as they ever have. And interestingly, the internet came into widespread use about 20 years ago. Libraries have stuck around. I mean, the drama of, oh my God, we don't need libraries, I think has kind of come and gone, or at least the moment, the inflection point has passed. But we do need libraries. They are places. They're not just an online portal. They're physical places that we share as a community, and there aren't very many of those. We have public parks, and we have libraries, and honestly, I can't think of very many places that we as a people own together and share together and see who we are as a community within them. Secondly, libraries have done a remarkable job in embracing the internet and making the internet another part of what they offer, rather than seeing them in opposition. I mean, if libraries had just said, we have books, that's what we have, these would have become museums. They would be museums where you'd go to look at those interesting things called books.
Right.
But that's not at all what libraries have done. They've become the portal of knowledge and information through physical books, through the internet, through events, through learning and community events that it's like a living library now. I think in a way that maybe 20 years ago we weren't that good at making libraries so vital. Maybe the sort of spook of the internet taking over made libraries really reassess what they are to a community and made that so much more vital. I mean, everything from citizenship services to being children's story hours, the fact that there are lots of books that are not online, believe it or not. And this is an interesting fun fact, which is Americans were surveyed as to whether they believed everything was available online, and people under 30 were more inclined to say that they didn't think everything was online versus people over 30 who, I mean, I don't quite understand that, but I think it's wonderful.
Right.
And I also think we are entering a world where a sharing economy is really thriving, and that the idea of sharing things like books now has been re-energized. That this idea that you don't have to own everything, that you can share things with the community, and that's its own value. There's something wonderful. Talk about Marie Kondo. I mean, if you can take all of it, we all own all of these books.
Right.
How fabulous. I don't have room for them in my house, but you can take them out one at a time. I mean, there's something where the idea of borrowing books actually suits the way we are grappling with the way we live in a really timely way. I feel really optimistic about libraries. I think that they have weathered the incursion of the internet, and they've changed, but I see them thriving and blossoming.
I think that's true, and there are more public libraries than Starbucks. Yay! But I think that the libraries, public libraries in particular, have done a great job of adapting. They've been more intentional about the kinds of services they provide. They are not just about books, but they're about a range of services. We have just opened a new maker lab, so people can come in and do a project, and they can sew, and they can use a hand drill, and
That's
they can
great.
get a lamp rewired. And these are the kinds of things that libraries have gotten good at because they want to be providing the most value to the communities that they serve. So it's brought around a whole culture of innovation in I think, a lot of surprising ways. I wanted to kind of close my part with a quote that you used in the book, where you said, in Senegal, the polite expression for saying someone died is to say his or her library has burned. Tell us what that quote meant to you and your personal story.
This was a quote that I had come across while I was working on the book. I don't even remember now where I came across it, but I wrote it out on an index card, and I had it hanging over my desk while I was working on the book. And I kept thinking, I've got to figure out how to fit that in. I don't understand what it means, but I like it. When I began working on the book, I had very excitedly told my mother that I was doing this, and because my mother had been my library buddy, I knew she would be thrilled and take credit for it. And it was wonderful. I mean, she was thrilled to imagine that she had inspired me to want to write about libraries. Not long after I began working on the book, my mother was diagnosed with dementia. In the next, what feels like a very short amount of time, her memory began disappearing. It was that experience that made me begin thinking how our minds are really like libraries, that we contain volumes and volumes of memories, of knowledge, of fantasies, of vignettes, stories. All of them are stored almost like little individual books in our minds. And similarly, our attachment to libraries, I think, is because they are our communal mind, and they contain all of the stories of a culture. And seeing my mother lose her memory, it was as if all of those volumes that were in her private library were disappearing. And it gave a certain urgency to the book to me, because so much of what had first triggered my desire to write about it was remembering those trips with her and savoring the memory of what going to the library had meant to me. And unfortunately, she passed away before I had finished the book. But I felt that I had, in some small way, captured those memories forever.
Right. Well, it's a great tribute to her, and I didn't want to leave the conversation without talking about that quote, which is really lovely. So we now want to turn it over to you all for some questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. So if you'll just please line up in the middle here, and we'll take as many as we can. And please do be mindful. We want to get as many people as possible. So if you can be short with your question, that would be great. Thanks.
I wanted to ask you about the quotes that you use at the beginning of each chapter, how you selected them, and how you intended them to illuminate the contents of the chapters.
Sure. Well, those are all books that are in the LA Library's catalog currently. I chose books that, in one way or another, would foreshadow what the next chapter was about. The reason I used them was, as I was saying earlier, I like the idea that you would feel as if you were browsing a library while you were reading the book and moving from one story to another story. And so this was my little sort of gesture to that experience of being in a library and looking, you're looking for one book, but you see all of these other books as you're walking down the row.
That's great.
I love the book. It was a terrific book. And
Thank you.
But I never read the book. I listened to it on Audible. And the Audible, sometimes you get good readers and sometimes you don't get good readers. That's one of the risks. The other risk is you can't browse ahead and flip around and see where she's going and all that. So the entire reading of the book was really frustrating because I thought you were going to get to one thing and you never got it. And I kept hoping you would and hoping you would and hoping you would, particularly the way you opened each chapter with all the books and the numbers. A writer as gifted as you, I can't believe you didn't take on the explanation of what the hell the Dewey Decimal System is all about and what it's made of. It would have been a tremendous service to the
That's
rest
right.
of us.
Oh, that's
man.
my next book. My next book.
Right. Or a revised version, at least, anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're very welcome.
My wife read this book, and I read part of it, but I bought it tonight, too. I notice it doesn't have an index. Is there a reason for that?
I'm lazy. That's the honest truth. I just didn't want to go to the trouble of indexing it, and I mean, but there's a real reason, which is, while I think an index is helpful after you've read a book and you want to go back and find something, I wanted people to have an immersive experience of the book. I wanted them to begin at the beginning and read through to the end. And I didn't want to encourage anybody to be, and I'm not even sure what people would look up in the index, but
Harry Peak, actually.
Yeah,
I was
well-
gonna look him up. I found his picture, don't worry.
yeah.
I found it.
So I really wanted people to just, even not having a dust jacket, I just wanted it to be you and this book, and you immerse yourself in it and read it through to the end.
I will, thanks.
Okay, you're welcome.
I have read the book all the way through.
Oh,
This is a very physically satisfying book to touch, to look at, to feel, to examine. It's very satisfying. And I wondered if you could talk about your decision making. I did notice that at the very end you talk about how glossy pages you could never recover. And I noticed that all your photographs, that you don't have any glossy
Right.
pages in your book. And I wondered if that was intentional. What was your strategy for your book? It's wonderful.
Oh, sure, thank you. Well, as I said from the beginning, I didn't want a dust jacket. I just didn't want anything between you and the physical object of the book. And I wanted it to feel like it could have been a book from any moment in time, that it didn't feel like it was meant to be old-timey, but that it was timeless. We didn't have glossy photographs because we wanted them to be embedded in the page itself, and you can't do different, I mean, you could, but it would look not very pretty to have some pages be on glossy paper, but I wanted the pictures to be within the text, so that's why they were printed in just black and white. And we were very mindful of having a book about books be an exceptional book, an exceptional object that spoke to its existence as a book in a very, very particular way. And I'm so proud of how it turned out. I think it's so beautiful.
It's fascinating to hear you discuss your book, and I really enjoy your work.
Thank
I
you.
also really enjoyed Mary Norris's recent book about her experiences on the editing and proofreading staff at The New Yorker. And I wondered, have you thought about doing a book about The New Yorker from your unique perspective? And do you have any good Lou Burke stories?
Oh, well, I am actually writing a new book. God help me. That's essentially a memoir of my writing life that will certainly include a lot about my experiences at The New Yorker. And with luck, it will take me less time than this book took. But, that's been my professional home since, my first piece came out in 1987, coincidentally. It was a big year for me. It was 86, the library burned down. 87, I had my first piece in The New Yorker. So it's been a place that's been an incredible home to me. That'll be really fun to write about.
Thanks.
Hi, I just want to say I very much enjoyed your book. I read it actually while I was traveling across the country. For the last 18 months, I've been traveling by RV. And one of the things that my husband and I did every time we went to a small town was actually visit the local library
Oh, that's great.
to kind of see how it was. And and also like a lot of the RV stops we had their own little libraries, very much about sharing and all that. So, because you don't want to have a lot of books with you on the road, so you share and kind of distribute and a lot. But I was wondering, for you, when researching this book, did you travel to a lot of libraries, or do you do that as a hobby when you're in a new place, maybe go and see the local library and what they have to offer?
Well, I had never done that before. And now I realize that it's first of all, a lot of libraries are really interesting buildings. So if you're simply interested in architecture, it's really fun to see these libraries. But it's also a wonderful place to get a flavor of a city. Now I've been in, you name the city, I've been in the library. I've been on book tour since October, and I have seen a lot of libraries, and it's been amazing. It's really been wonderful, and it is certainly something that I think now that I'm aware of what a pleasure it is, I'll definitely do it in the future. It's really a treat.
Yeah, and it's harder sometimes in small towns when they don't have libraries, or they don't, like I've seen when we were visiting like local malls that were mostly abandoned, but they'd still have maybe a library and like an old shop or something like that.
Yeah.
It's something where it's still essential to communities. So I appreciate that about your book, that you
Thank
were
you.
talking about that. So thank you.
You didn't ask me, but I do that all the time.
Yeah.
I travel.
No, it's a
I
fun
visit-
thing.
yeah.
You go to
No,
like
it's-
the local church, the general store, and the library.
But I take pictures, I introduce myself, I figure out how they're organized, and the architecture is always worth the price, so.
Because how does a place house as many books as they have?
It's a great hobby.
Yeah. Well, thank you both.
Thanks.
Hi, my friend Karen and I often share books, and when she reads a book, she underlines in very faint pencil. When I read the book, I put in little sticky things,
Yeah.
and after we're finished, we get together and we discuss, our favorite parts, and sometimes I mark where the plot turns or just a beautiful sentence. And I was wondering if you have some particularly favorite parts of the book that you could share with us.
Oh, that's well, I do. I guess it's probably not surprising, but there's a section in the beginning where I talk about going to the library with my mother. That is particularly, that satisfied me very much as a writer, because I felt like I really said what I was trying to say. And, excuse me. But I also think that the last 2 or 3 pages, which, it's tough to end a book, and it's particularly tough when it's not as if there's a natural end to a book. So I was really worried about how I was going to finish this book. And I ended up being really, really proud of those last couple of pages. And it felt, I was both proud of the writing, but I also felt like it had a sort of, it felt conclusive. It felt like it brought the book around properly, and that you could feel toward the end satisfaction as a reader. So those meant a lot to me. I also, just one more, boy, I could talk about this all night. Describing the fire, which was really tricky to figure out how to do that, and I ended up really enjoying doing it. And I mean, it was very challenging because I had to take all these fire department reports and these insurance company reports and eyewitness accounts and try to somehow internalize them all and then write that section. And I really enjoyed doing it.
That was traumatic to read physically. I kept having to put it down and go, take a deep breath and then come back to it.
Well, then
So
I
just
did.
powerful.
I did what I set out to do.
Good.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. First, I wanted to thank you as a librarian and as somebody who got engaged in a library for complexifying the library on a page for people who don't always understand what it is that we do every day. It's just so crucial, and hearing it from librarians all the time doesn't mean anything to
Right.
patrons. So thank you. But I also I consider myself a writer as well. And typically I do fiction, but I recently found myself falling into a nonfiction project of long form, which I'm totally intimidated by. So I would love any advice that you can give to somebody who's attempting this for the first time.
Well, first of all, that's wonderful. I think the best advice that I can give, which doesn't sound particularly imaginative, but that is just to read as much of the best nonfiction that you can find, and then read some more and read lots of it, and in as much as you can, diagram them so you see how they work and what the mechanism is of a piece of nonfiction writing that you really love. I think, believe it or not, when I teach, I encourage people to imitate the writing that you really love. And eventually, you won't be imitating it anymore, but as following the structure that other people have done that you're impressed by, and trying some of the techniques that you read and like, is the way you eventually find your own voice as a writer.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Since this is Arlington, and while you're here, have you visited the Pentagon Library and their experience with 9/11 and some of the damage that it incurred?
Unfortunately, no. I just got in last night, and so I haven't seen anything at all except the inside of my hotel room and a restaurant. But I'm sure that would have been a really. I hope I'm back in D.C. not infrequently, so it'd be something interesting to see.
They did have some damage, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Right. So a couple of quick things before we talk about the signing. Susan didn't mention the architect. Bertram Goodhue was the architect of the Central Library in LA. If you want to see a local example of his work, the National Academy of Sciences building on Constitution Avenue in DC is a pretty good representative example. And secondly, just to underscore again, we were talking about the sharing economy. If you want to get rid of your old books, the Friends will take them. They have the book sale. The money comes back to buy more books for the library. It's Arlington's oldest recycling program. So it would be a real help to us, and it helps us sponsor evenings like this. Without the Friends, we would not be able to have first-rate authors come and talk to us about things that matter. So it's a real terrific relationship, and one that we couldn't survive without. So thanks all for being here. Thank you, Susan. It was.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It was amazing, and now
Thank you.
we'll talk about how to do the book signing, but thank you all.
Thank you guys so much for coming. One More Page Books is here selling books, so if you'd like to purchase a book, you can. We're going to be making a nice orderly line back there, and we're going to be doing the book signing in this quiet study room. So you'll be going in that door, and we're going to come out this door.